Hi there, folks. Today I'm going to talk about determining whether or not it's safe to go out kayak fishing on the ocean. Now, there's good reason to want to go kayak fishing in the ocean. There's tons of great bottom fishing out there for lingcod, rockfish, halibut, salmon, and if you're lucky enough to live in the southern part of the west coast, then you might even get into some yellowtail or other species. But there's a lot of considerations that a kayak angler needs to make in determining whether or not it's safe to go. Part of this has to do with the skill set and equipment of the kayak angler that they need in order to have a safe and productive trip out on the Pacific Ocean. But additionally, you need to be able to take into consideration swell, which means you got to be able to read swell forecasts and understand a little bit about wave science. And then you also need to understand wind forecasts and how those can interact with swells when you're out there and can potentially create hazardous conditions for you that might not be readily apparent unless you understand how these two things interact. So today I'm going to walk you through some of the basics that you might need to help you make an informed decision and have a safe trip out on the salt. So one of the easiest things that kayak anglers can do to prepare for a trip out on the salt is to get the correct safety equipment. And due to the cold water currents that run along the west coast of North America, the water temps here really don't get all that warm, and you really don't know how long it's going to take for rescue to come. So it's good to have a full body immersion suit. These can be dry suits or wet suits that will keep you comfortable in the event that you get wet or that you get flipped over out there and you can't self-rescue. Additionally, you're going to need a PFD. You're going to need a handheld waterproof VHF radio and have a good understanding of how to operate that radio and proper VHF etiquette. The main thing you need to be aware of is that channel 16 is the channel you need in order to get a hold of Coast Guard in the event of an emergency. Additionally, cell phones, if they're within range of a cell tower, you can also use that to contact 911. Additionally, you're going to need a whistle to make some noise, and I always recommend carrying a handheld flare or smoke because kayaks do disappear out on the ocean. They're very hard for the Coast Guard to see when they're searching for you from the air or from a boat, so it's always good to have one of those on hand. Now, one of the most critical skills that a kayak angler should have is the ability to self-rescue. And you really shouldn't be going out on the ocean unless you are capable of flipping your kayak back over and getting back in your kayak in under 180 seconds. 120 seconds is much better, and that's what your target goal should be. These water temperatures are very cold, and in 5 minutes or more, you're going to start getting exhausted. So you need to be able to get back in your boat in under 3 minutes. You also need to possess the physical strength to get back to your original launch location, especially if winds come up unexpectedly. So being able to know your physical limitations, know your boat, know how far you can go, know how far you can get back in the event of weather, and also just being super aware of changing conditions. If things start to shift at all towards bad weather, you need to get out of there. Don't hold on out there because rarely does the weather improve through the day. It seems like the wind always does tend to get worse here as the day goes on. Okay, so one of the first things you need to be able to do is to interpret wave forecasts. In order to do that, you need to understand some of the terminology. So first, let's talk about wave height. Wave height is a measure of the wave's height from the crest down to the nearest trough. They actually report the average of the top third of the waves that are coming through, the upper average. And then there's wavelength, which isn't too often reported, which is a measure from crest to crest. And then there's period, which measures the amount of time it takes from one crest to pass till the next one. And that one is probably one of the most important to anglers. Now, there are two sources of waves when you're out on the ocean. There are swell waves. So these are large, powerful waves that are generated by storms far away. Some of the attributes of swell is that as swell waves move across the ocean and away from the source where they're produced, they tend to get a longer period. That is, the waves tend to move apart. and they tend to decline in size. Whereas wind waves always go in the direction of wind. So sometimes swell will be going in the opposite direction of wind because there are many different storms producing swell out on the ocean. Whereas wind waves are always going in the direction of the wind. They tend to be a little bit tighter together, so they have a shorter period. Their period tends to be 10 seconds or less, whereas swell can be 7 seconds all the way up to 20 plus seconds. So they can overlap a little bit, but they are very distinctly different. So in general, I am looking for swell heights that are 5 foot or less, and I'm looking for a period that is at least twice as long as the swell height. That'll help to flatten out those waves and make it more comfortable when I'm out on the ocean. So for example, with these cartoons here, you can see these waves here, these are all waves of equal height. These first set of waves have a period of 10 seconds. This next set of waves here has a period of 15 seconds, and you see it flattens it out quite a bit. So it would be a lot more comfortable to be out on the ocean with these conditions. And then this last set has a 20-second period, and it's almost hardly noticeable that there's a wave there at all, even though those waves have equal height. Now you might be under the impression that a long period is great no matter what, but if you're beach launching, it's something that you need to take into consideration is that longer period waves will generate bigger breaking waves on the beach. So a 4-foot wave at 10 seconds is going to have a 6-foot breaking wave, whereas a 4-foot at 20-second period is actually going to have a larger breaking wave on the beach. And you might be wondering, why is that? And it has to do with the actual size and amount of energy stored in that wave. So the bigger a wave is, the more energy it has stored in it. So here are two waves of equal height, but the one on the top is half the period of the one on the bottom. So if we took and put that down there on top of it, superimpose it, see there's a lot more water stored in that longer period wave, which results in a bigger break and more energy when it hits the beach. Okay, let's talk about wind and wind waves. In general, most marine forecasts are going to report wind speeds in knots. Here's a little table to help you convert those into miles per hour and the expected wave heights. In general, kayak anglers are not going to want to be out in wind speeds over 11 knots. So be wary of those types of forecasts, but also be aware that not all wind forecasts are created equal. So for example, we need to talk about fetching. Fetching is the amount of open water that wind has moved over. So if it's coming from offshore across open ocean, the wind is going to be a much bigger factor than it is if it's coming from inland where it has not been moving across open water. However, you have to take into consideration directionality as well. Most of our swells come out of the northwest, and oftentimes our wind direction will move from the northwest. You will get some building of waves as these two work together, but you'll actually get a substantially larger amount of building of waves if you have wind running up against the primary swell direction. Which brings me to the discussion of primary versus secondary swell. You will see in forecasts like this one on Magic Seaweed, you have that main primary swell forecast in the middle there, but sometimes you'll see one or more secondary swells reported. And oftentimes, if these are relatively small with long periods, they will not contribute greatly to sea conditions, but sometimes they can be nearly as influential as the primary swell. So if you see secondary swells with really large heights and short periods, you need to be wary. Now, if secondary swells are running in the same direction as the primary swells, they can cause wave height to build a little bit, but generally this still makes for a rather pleasant experience out on the water. Versus if you have relatively large secondary swells coming in perpendicular or in different directions to your primary swell, this can create sloppy mixed ocean conditions, which are very unpleasant to be on. We often refer to these as confused ocean conditions, and this is oftentimes where you'll see people who are new to the ocean chumming over the side because it's very uncomfortable as the kayak gets rocked back and forth. So I hope that this video helped clarify reading forecasts and understanding ocean conditions a little more, and also understanding what you need to have in terms of equipment and skill in order to have a safe trip on the ocean. This chart here is just sort of a rough sketch of what I use to determine whether or not I want to go out in those conditions. So if the conditions are in the green, then generally I feel like I'm going to have a pleasant experience in the water. If it's in the yellow, I should probably be getting off the water, and red, I wouldn't even consider being out there. So if you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit like and subscribe. And hopefully I'll see you guys out on the water, and I hope you have a safe and successful trip out on the salt.